What's up, guys? This is first period on Thursday, and we're still working on our current assignments. I'm going to introduce the next one and talk about our upcoming stuff, but it's not, I don't want to pile on more and more while we still have things. So you've got your project, and most of you guys have turned those in. I've looked at some and graded or commented, but not all, and it's just taking time. That's no problem. Then I posted one assignment after that, and it's about the genre. So obviously the class is titled sci-fi and fantasy, but we've so far only read science fiction. There's one about being on the moon, and there was one about aliens, and there was one about computing, AI, philosophy type stuff, and all of those cover similar ground as fantasy. Like for example, the Arthur C. Clarke story, The 9 Billion Names of God, is about these monks who build a computer that's supposed to calculate and try all the possible names of God, and then eventually find one. That's something that you could do in a fantasy story. You could have monks who are working to contact their god in some way, and maybe they would do it through spells instead of technology, but it could be a similar premise, And so they are overlapping, and I wanted to show one story where it really could go either way. And the story I showed you guys was Replacements by Lisa Tuttle. And I don't know why, it seems like I've given you several stories that were from the 90s. I haven't been doing it intentionally. We'll get more variety as we go. And this story, if you've read it, is about a guy who is walking down the street and he sees a little creature, and it's sort of ugly. The way that she describes it, the way the narrator describes it, kind of reminds me of Salacious Crumb, the guy from Star Wars who's sitting at Jabba's side and laughing at his jokes, and he's got that weird bat monkey kookaburra combo. Salacious B. Crumb. That's sort of a classic George Lucas name. I kind of imagine something like that, except with less personality. It doesn't have eyes that look at you like they understand, and it doesn't laugh at a joke. It's very strange. It's very like, there's a chance we might read some H.P. Lovecraft in here. It's one of our candidates. And he often describes creatures and things that are just different than what we would communicate with and that we would understand. So this little guy in the story is just weird. You can't figure out if it understands you or what it's going for, or if it's nice or what. And the guy kills it because he's just overcome with disgust. But then he sees another and another, and then he gets home and his wife says, "Hey, look what I found," and she has one. But it turns out that she doesn't hate it the way that he does. Some people in this city end up taking these guys as little pets, and it goes from there, and it feels kind of like a Twilight Zone or a Black Mirror, or one of those where our main character is just unable to understand why the world is changing. He's like, why do people like these things? What's going on? Don't they see? And just like Twilight Zone or just like Black Mirror, this is a little bit of sci-fi, but it's not really science. It doesn't go into the rules. Nobody tests the DNA of these creatures, and nobody figures out where they came from. You could describe it as horror, just like, Twilight Zone is not. If you went on Wikipedia and searched the genre, it probably wouldn't say horror, number one. The same for Black Mirror or any of those, but they definitely have it. And this author, Lisa Tuttle, is often classified as horror, and she writes stories that involve ghosts and other more classic horror things. It would not be crazy to put this next to fantasy stories, because they have a weird creature and it has some weird rules, and it's not completely far off from a goblin or a vampire or something like that. So the questions I had in that assignment are about, how do you see this, and is it easy for you to put it in a category, or is it really up in the air and you could have gone different ways? And then how do you put it in a category? Is it based on, oh, there was one thing that, like, oh, on page 5 they mentioned this and that really set me off in a specific direction? Or is it more of like a general feel of like, well, this had a couple moments that were scary enough that I'm going to call it horror, or this had a couple moments where it was like realistic enough that I'm going to call it sci-fi. It really depends, and there are no right or wrong answers, except you got to have a little bit of thought and say, here's why I put it the way I put it, and here's why I saw it the way I saw it. So a couple people have turned that in, and if you're still working, that's fine. The story's a little bit long. It's like 15 pages. I'm going to mention our next thing now, and if you want, if you're done with this, if you're done with the replacements story, you could look at the next one. If you're not, that's fine. We'll officially do it next week, and you will not be behind. But the next story I'm going to post for you guys, which, by the way, is shorter, it's 5 pages, is actually fantasy. Like, it's definitely fantasy. It's not sci-fi. It's not horror. It's maybe you'd put it in the category of like a fable or a fairy tale, because it's so short and kind of simple. But anyone who read this would say, yeah, fantasy. First word that comes to their mind. Like, this is not unclear at all. So this story, and I'll post it if you want to read it, and maybe I'll read a tiny bit aloud, but I actually don't know if you read stuff aloud, there's always a fear in the back of my mind that it's like a YouTube copyright issue or something. But we have a story called Cinnamon by a guy named Neil Gaiman, and you may have heard of this guy. Neil Gaiman wrote a bunch of children's stories, fantasy stories that have been popular themselves, but have also been adapted into movies and comic books and TV shows and other things. So if you know Stardust or Coraline or American Gods, or a little before then, before your time, he had a series called The Sandman, which was very big. I think I heard that they're making a new show with that. But anyway, this story does the thing that fantasy can do, which is that it tells you right at the beginning something crazy, and it doesn't have to explain it. It doesn't have to get into the rules or anything like that. It just says, hey, this girl, her eyes were pearls. Okay? Do we care about like the nerve endings? Are they connected to her brain? Are they a risk of infection? Were they grown through mineral deposits in her mother's? It doesn't matter. Okay? It's fantasy. You can just say stuff. And especially you can just say stuff at the beginning. You know, if you brought in a realistic story and then on like chapter 30 you said, oh, by the way, there are people who have pearls for eyes, that would be weird. But if you say it in the first sentence or the first paragraph, you can say anything you want. There's a classic short story, I'm sure you'll read it in one of your English classes, Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. And it starts by saying, oh, this guy turned into, one day he woke up and he turned into a giant cockroach, a vermin. It's a story written in another language, so the translation is always slightly different. But he woke up one day and he was a giant insect. And then it goes from there. But in that first sentence, crazy stuff can happen. And after that, it kind of proceeds normally. So what I'm going to post is I'm going to post this story. You guys can read it if you like. If you want to wait until next time, if you're still doing the other ones, that's great. And I'm going to post some questions that are specific to fantasy, that are about the fact that you can do crazy stuff. You have a character who has pearls for eyes, and then you have slight spoiler for a couple pages later, you have an animal that talks. Okay, in some ways it feels like a fairy tale Disney-ish, except a little more danger, a little more risk to the characters. Then the questions are going to cover stuff like, in fantasy you usually have morality. You have this like good and evil, and it's not always simple. Sometimes you get surprised that, oh, this thing we thought was good was actually not. But there's usually a more deep connection to that than in sci-fi. You might be kind of lost in this cold universe and nobody can tell what's good or not. But in fantasy, there's usually like the queen or the good witch or the gods who have a very clear moral sense, and then there's like the bad witch or the demons or the underworld that has the other side. And then we'll go from there, and we'll read a longer fantasy story next, and we'll see how they compare. But it is nice to get into that, because sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes, like, you can have a character who flies and it's a jetpack, and then you can have another character who flies with a witch's broom, and it's all the same. Like, they fly, who cares if it's sci-fi or fantasy? But other times it really does matter, and it, like, one genre has totally different rules and flavor and expectations where it wouldn't work the other way. So I'm going to end this video before it gets super long, and I'm going to post this story if you want to read it and get ahead. But if you're still working on the previous, that's fine. I'm still grading the previous, so I don't want to pile on more. Thanks.